There are requests that carry the weight of a lifetime of suffering, words that escape the lips like last gasps of hope in a world that has long forgotten the meaning of compassion. Samuel Morrison owned land that stretched for miles under the relentless Arizona sun. His calloused hands knew every stone, every dry bush, every broken promise that the arid land held in its bowels. He was a man who built his fortune on the harshness of the desert and the stubbornness of those who do not accept defeat. But on that September morning, when the wind carried the smell of a distant storm, Samuel would find that some victories cost more than any man should ever pay. The sun was still battling the shadows of dawn when he found her. Sitting by the abandoned well on the edge of her property, a young woman with golden hair that shone like ripe wheat in the rising light. His torn clothes told a story of desperate flight, of nights slept in the open, of fear that had become a constant companion. She looked up as she saw him approaching, and in that look, Samuel recognized something familiar, the despair of those who have nothing left to lose. The girl did not run away when he dismounted from the horse. He remained motionless, like a wounded animal that no longer has the strength to fight. Samuel noticed how his fingers trembled, how his breath was chopped, how his whole body seemed ready to unravel at the slightest touch. He was young, perhaps 20 years old, but his eyes carried the ancient wisdom of one who knew the dark side of humanity before his time. He offered her water, which she drank with the thirst of someone who had spent days walking under the scorching sun. She offered food, which she accepted with the silent gratitude of someone who had learned that kindness is a rare luxury in this world. But when Samuel reached out to push away a lock of hair that fell over his wounded face, she drew back as if she had seen a serpent. The words came from his lips like a desperate prayer, charged with a terror that made the surrounding air seem denser. "Please, don't touch my hair." It was a simple request. But Samuel realized that behind those words was hidden a story that no soul should carry. His own hands trembled, not from fear or hesitation, but from a sudden and painful realization. The farmer had seen a lot in his years wandering the West. He knew the men who turned might into law, who confused power with right, who left invisible scars deeper than any physical wound. At that moment, observing the trembling on the young woman's lips, Samuel understood that it was not only water and food that she needed. It was someone who respected her pain without asking questions, who offered protection without demanding explanations. The wind was blowing stronger now, bringing with it the smell of rain and the promise of change. Samuel knew that his life had just taken a different turn. Not because he wanted to be a hero, but because he recognized in the young woman something that she thought she had lost a long time ago. The ability to awaken in another human being, the need to protect what was still pure in this world. He pulled his hands back, respecting the space she had created around herself. He didn't ask questions about his past. He didn't demand explanations about his injuries. He didn't try to console him with empty words. It just stood there, a silent presence that offered security without demanding anything in return. And for the first time in a long time, Samuel Morrison felt that perhaps there was still something good he could do in this barren, lawless land. The storm was approaching on the horizon, dark and full of promise. But there, by the abandoned well, two wounded souls found the first moment of peace they had known in a long time. It was just the beginning of a journey that would test the limits of human compassion and reveal that sometimes the greatest courage lies in knowing when not to act, when respecting the suffering of others is more important than any gesture of kindness. The rain came as a blessing in the late afternoon, washing away the accumulated dust and bringing relief to the sweltering desert air. Samuel had prepared a place for the young woman in the barn, away from the main house, respecting her need for distance and safety. She accepted the shelter with a silent nod, walking with careful steps, like someone who has learned to measure every move so as not to arouse unwanted attention. For the next 3 days, a silent routine was established between them. Samuel left food and clean water at the entrance to the barn every morning, never getting too close, always announcing his presence with the clatter of boots on dry wood. She remained in the shadows, watching him work from afar, studying his gestures with the caution of someone who had learned that trusting can be a dangerous luxury. The farmer noticed how she avoided any sudden movement, how her eyes constantly followed his hands, how her body stiffened whenever he moved towards her. They were signs that Samuel recognized, invisible marks left by experiences that no one should carry. He himself had seen men come back from war with the same distant look, the same constant tension on their shoulders, the same difficulty in accepting gestures of kindness. On the fourth morning, Samuel found a surprise waiting for him. The barn had been organized, the old tools that lay scattered on the floor, neat and clean, stacked neatly against the wall. It was a small gesture, but loaded with meaning. She was trying to repay the kindness she had received in the only way she knew how, offering work in exchange for protection. That afternoon, Samuel decided to break the silence that had been established between them, not with words, but with actions. She began working on repairing a fence near the barn, purposely choosing a spot where she could observe it without feeling exposed. He worked slowly, with deliberate movements, showing through gestures that his hands knew honest work, that they were hands accustomed to building, not destroying. During the work, Samuel began to speak, not directly to her, but as if talking to himself. He told about his farm, about how he had arrived in those lands years before, alone and carrying his own scars. He talked about the seasons he had faced, the harsh winters and the unforgiving summers, about how he had learned that the earth does not forgive, but neither does it judge. His words flowed smoothly, without pressure, like water, finding its natural way between the stones. On the fifth day, something changed. Samuel was repairing the roof of the house when he heard a different noise coming from the barn. It was a sound I hadn't heard in a long time, someone humming softly. The melody was melancholic, full of nostalgia, but there was a quality in it that made the farmer's heart tighten with emotion. It was the sound of someone who was beginning to feel safe enough to express a piece of his soul. That afternoon, when Samuel went to leave his usual food, he found something that surprised him. She was sitting at the entrance to the barn, still in the shadows, but visible for the first time. Her golden hair was neatly braided, kept away from her face, and she wore one of the clean shirts he had left for her a few days earlier. But it was what she saw in her hands that really caught her eye. She was sewing, mending one of his old clothes, with small, precise stitches. The two looked at each other for a moment that seemed to last forever. There were no words, but there was communication. In her eyes, Samuel saw something that wasn't there before, the first glimmer of hope. It wasn't confidence yet. It was too early for that, but it was the recognition that perhaps not all men were equal to those who had hurt her. Samuel put the food in the usual place and walked away, but this time he walked more slowly. When he reached the porch of his house, he dared to look back. She was still there watching him, and for the first time in 6 days, she didn't retreat into the shadows when their gazes met. The afternoon wind brought the smell of sage and creosote, familiar scents of the desert that had always meant loneliness to Samuel. But at that moment, as he watched the young woman he had met at the well, he realized that perhaps loneliness was not his permanent companion. Perhaps there was room in his barren life for something different, something he had forgotten was possible, the possibility of mattering to someone, of being needed not for his strength or his land, but for his ability to offer security without demanding anything in return. Night fell softly over the farm, bringing with it stars that shone with particular intensity in the clear desert sky. And for the first time since he had found her, Samuel slept peacefully, knowing that he had planted the first seed of trust in a heart that had learned to distrust everything and everyone. Time in the desert has its own rhythm, measured not by men's clocks, but by subtle changes in light, in the wind, in the way shadows dance among the cacti. 2 weeks had passed since Samuel had found the young woman at the well, and each day brought small changes that only attentive eyes could perceive. She had begun to venture beyond the barn during the hottest hours of the day, when Samuel worked in the distant fields. First, just to the well where they met, then to the abandoned vegetable garden behind the house, where he began to pull the weeds that choked the few vegetables that still struggled to survive. They were small but significant steps, signs that something inside her was beginning to awaken from the long sleep of fear. Samuel pretended not to notice these excursions, but secretly provided clean and sharp gardening tools, casually lying around where she could find them. He also began to leave seeds along with daily food, tomato, bean and pumpkin seeds, that could flourish even in the arid land if cared for with patience and care. It was on a Saturday morning that everything changed. Samuel was repairing the well pump when he heard footsteps approaching. It wasn't the silent, cautious steps he'd learned to recognize, but something different, firmer. When he looked up, he saw her walking towards him, carrying a wooden bucket in her hands. She stopped at a respectful distance, but for the first time there was no fear in her eyes. There was determination and something else that Samuel took a moment to recognize: purpose. She pointed to the broken bomb, then to the bucket, and Samuel understood. She wanted to help. She wanted to be useful. She wanted to contribute to the place that had become her refuge. They worked side by side that morning, she holding the pieces while he adjusted them, passing the tools when necessary. They did not exchange a word, but there was constant communication through looks and gestures. Samuel noticed how she carefully avoided any physical contact, how her hands always moved in a way that kept a safe distance from his. It was a delicate, respectful dance, where every movement was measured and considered. When the pump finally worked and the water began to gush clear and fresh, she did something that surprised Samuel: smiled. It wasn't a full smile. There was still too much pain in his eyes for that, but it was genuine. It was the first time Samuel had seen any expression of joy cross his face, and the impact was greater than he expected. He felt something move in his chest, something that had been dormant for years. That afternoon, while Samuel was working on the fence in the east pasture, he saw smoke rising from the chimney of the house. He hadn't kindled a fire in the fireplace since morning, and for a moment fear overwhelmed him. He ran back, fearing that something had happened, only to find a smell he hadn't smelled in years emanating from the kitchen: fresh bread being baked. She was standing in the kitchen door when he arrived, watching her reaction with a mixture of nervousness and hope. There was flour on her hands and arms, and for the first time Samuel noticed that she had loosened her hair from the tight braids, letting it fall loose down her shoulders. It was a small but meaningful gesture of trust, an indication that she was beginning to feel safe in his presence. Samuel stopped at the entrance of the kitchen, respecting the space she had occupied, but he couldn't hide his emotion. The kitchen was transformed, not only clean, but organized in a way that suggested care and attention to detail. The table was set for two, with the dishes that had belonged to Samuel's mother kept so long that he had almost forgotten their existence. She gestured timidly to the table, a silent invitation that carried the weight of an offering of peace. Samuel understood that this was a crucial moment, a turning point in their relationship. He washed his hands in the basin near the door, moving slowly, telegraphing his every action so as not to frighten her. They sat at the table, facing each other for the first time. The bread was perfect, golden and aromatic, and Samuel couldn't help but breathe in satisfaction as he tasted it. She watched his reaction carefully, and when she saw his approving smile, something in his posture relaxed. It was then that she spoke, not words yet, but a sound, low and hesitant. He was trying to say something, struggling to find his voice after weeks of silence. Samuel waited patiently, without pressing, without trying to anticipate his words. Finally, in a barely audible whisper, she succeeded. "Thank you." It was a simple word, but loaded with meaning. Not only gratitude for the food and shelter, but for respect, for patience, for having given her back the possibility of believing that there was still goodness in the world. Samuel nodded gravely, realizing the weight of that moment. "Thank you," he replied softly, "for reminding me that this house can be a home." The sun began to set when they finished eating, painting the sky with shades of orange and purple that reflected in the kitchen windows. Two strangers had met in the vast desert, each carrying his own wounds, and had discovered that sometimes healing begins not with grand gestures, but with small acts of mutual trust. The night promised to be peaceful, blessed by the aroma of fresh bread and the first conversation, albeit brief, between two souls who were learning that not all loneliness needs to be permanent. There are times in life when the past refuses to remain buried, when the shadows we thought we had left behind return to remind us that peace is a fragile present that can be broken without warning. Samuel woke up one October morning to the sound of horses approaching. It wasn't uncommon to have visitors on his farm, but something about the rhythm of the beating of his hooves made him uneasy. They were 4 horsemen, and they came too fast to be merchants or casual travelers. Through the window of his room, he saw them stop in the main courtyard, tough-looking men who scanned their surroundings with expert eyes. She must have heard it too, because when Samuel came downstairs, he found her leaning against the kitchen wall, shaking like a leaf in the wind. All the progress of the previous weeks had disappeared in an instant. His eyes were again filled with the terror he thought was diminishing, and his hands convulsively grasped the skirt of her dress as if he wanted to hide inside it. The men knocked on the door with unnecessary force, the kind of knock that carries an implicit threat. Samuel adjusted his hat and opened the door, keeping his expression neutral as his eyes quickly assessed the visitors. The leader was a tall, thin man with scars that told tales of violence and a sheriff's star that shone on his chest as a symbol of questionable authority. "Good morning," Samuel said, his voice calm but alert. "What can I help you with?" The sheriff spat on the ground before responding, a gesture of deliberate disrespect. "We are looking for a woman. Young blonde hair, disappeared from Tombstone a few weeks ago. Information says that it may be in these parts." Samuel felt his blood grow cold, but he kept his expression impassive. "I haven't seen anyone with that description around here. I live alone, as I have always lived." One of the men behind the sheriff stepped forward, a fellow with small, vicious eyes who scanned the property like a vulture looking for carrion. "Does it matter if we take a look? Sometimes these women hide in barns, stables, places like that." It was more of a command than a request, and Samuel knew that to refuse would be to admit suspicion. "Make yourself comfortable," he said, but added firmly, "as long as you respect my property." The men spread out around the farm like a plague, searching every corner, every building, every shade where anyone could hide. Samuel accompanied them, remaining calm despite the storm that roared within him. He knew she was in the house, probably hidden in the small basement where she kept preserves, a place she had shown her weeks earlier as a refuge in case of storms. The sheriff searched the barn with particular attention, noting the recent improvements, the organized tools, the signs that someone had taken care of the place. "You've been making changes around here," he remarked, his voice charged with suspicion. "A man has to keep his property in order," Samuel replied. "Winter is coming." The search lasted almost an hour during which Samuel felt every minute drag on like an eternity. Finally, the men regrouped in the courtyard, clearly frustrated that they had found nothing. But the sheriff wasn't pleased. There was something in his eyes that Samuel recognized, the obstinacy of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted, no matter the means. "She's worth a lot of money to certain people in Tombstone," the sheriff said, mounting his horse. "If you show up here, it would be in your best interest to let us know. Men who help fugitives sometimes encounter problems they didn't expect." The threat was clear, but Samuel did not back down. "If I see someone who matches the description, I'll know where to find them." After they left, Samuel waited until the sound of the horses completely disappeared before returning home. He found her exactly where he suspected it, huddled in the dark basement, shivering not only with fear, but with cold. Her clothes were soaked with sweat and tears, and when she looked up at him, Samuel saw in them an expression that made him realize at last the true extent of her terror. He reached out to help her up, but she instinctively backed off. "Please," he whispered, his voice broken with fear. "Don't give me to them." Samuel knelt at the entrance to the basement, placing himself on the same level as her. "Never," he said with a conviction that surprised himself. "As long as I breathe, you'll be safe here." She studied him for a long moment, looking for signs of lying on his face. She must have found only truth, because he finally accepted her hand and allowed him to help her out of the basement. But when they reached the lighted kitchen, Samuel saw something that made his heart tighten with anger and compassion. In desperation to hide, she had pulled her hair so hard that some strands were loose in her hands. There were scratches on his arms, from which he had pressed himself against the rough walls of the basement. But it was the expression in his eyes that affected him the most. It was the same desperate expression he had seen that first day by the well. Samuel now realized that these men were not just ordinary bounty hunters. There was something darker at play, something that turned a young woman into valuable prey for people who would not hesitate to use the law as a shield for their dark purposes. That night, while she slept fitfully in the barn, Samuel stood guard on the porch, rifle within arm's reach. Not only because he feared that men would return, but because he had made a decision that would change his life forever. It didn't matter who these men were or what authority they claimed to have. It didn't matter what trouble it might bring to him. Some battles are worth fighting, even when we know they can cost everything. And protecting an innocent soul from the evil that stalked it had become the most important battle of Samuel Morrison's life. The night wind carried the smell of change, and Samuel knew that the quiet days were over. But he also knew that he had found something worth fighting for, even if it meant facing demons they would rather leave alone. Truth has its own time to reveal itself, like desert flowers waiting for the right rain to bloom. 3 days have passed since the men's visit, 3 days of constant tension and vigilance. Samuel had changed his routine, always keeping close to the house, rifle always within reach. She was barely out of the basement now, fear having rebuilt the barriers it had taken so much effort to break down. It was on a silent morning that she finally found the courage to tell her story. Samuel was sitting in the kitchen drinking coffee and watching the horizon through the window when he heard barefoot footsteps on the stairs. She appeared in the doorway, pale but determined, carrying something in her hands. It was a yellowed letter, folded and refolded so many times that the marks looked like scars on the paper. With hesitant gestures, she placed it on the table between them. "My name is Mary," he said, his voice just a whisper. "Mary Winchester. And these men, they don't want to take me to justice." Samuel picked up the letter carefully, as if handling something sacred. It was a will signed by her father, leaving Mary a silver mine on the outskirts of Tombstone. A mine worth a fortune, and one that unscrupulous men had long coveted. "They killed my father," Mary continued, her voice gaining strength as the truth finally found its way into the light. "They made it look like an accident, but I saw it. And I fled with the only proof that remained of my rights." Samuel studied the document, recognizing the legitimacy of the seals and signatures. He then understood why the persecution was so relentless. It was not a question of capturing a common fugitive, but of silencing a witness and stealing a valuable inheritance. "Why tell me that now?" asked Samuel, carefully folding the letter. Mary looked up at him, and for the first time since they had met, there was no fear in them. There was something stronger, determination. "Because you gave me back something I thought I had lost forever," she said. "The ability to trust, and because maybe it's time to stop running away." Samuel nodded slowly. The time had come for a final decision. That afternoon, he rode to the nearest town, taking with him a copy of the will and a detailed letter about the events Mary had witnessed. He went to the federal judge, a man of integrity he had known for years, and put everything in his hands. When he returned to the farm at the end of the day, he found Mary on the porch, waiting for him. For the first time, she wasn't hiding in the shadows. She stood in the light of the setting sun, her golden hair shining freely in the wind. "It's done," Samuel said, dismounting from his horse. "The federal judge will be here tomorrow with trusted men. Your inheritance will be protected, and the real criminals will face justice." Mary walked up to him, stopping a few steps away. "And then?" he asked, his voice laden with a deeper question. Samuel looked at her, at the brave woman who had emerged from the terrified young woman he had met weeks before. "Then you will be free to go wherever you want," he said. "You're mine, your new life. The world is open to you." She nodded, but didn't walk away. Instead, he did something that surprised both of them. He held out his hand, offering it to him. Samuel looked at the outstretched hand, understanding the meaning of the gesture. It was more than just a touch. It was a symbol of trust earned, of fear overcome, of a possible future. When their hands touched, Samuel felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Not just hope that she would be safe, but hope that maybe her own loneliness could come to an end. "I'd like to stay," Mary said quietly, "if you'll take me in. Not as someone who needs protection, but as someone who has chosen to be here." The sun set over the desert that night, but for the first time in a long time, Samuel Morrison didn't feel alone watching the stars appear in the infinite sky. By her side, Mary Winchester had discovered that sometimes home is not a place we find, but something we build with the right people. And the night wind, which for so long had sung only songs of loneliness, now whispered promises of new dawns. You can't miss the upcoming journeys that await you on our channel, where each narrative reveals the mysteries and human dramas of the American Wild West. Sign up right now so you don't miss any adventures, and leave your comment below telling what was the moment that moved you the most in this story of Mary and Samuel.